Well, good evening, everyone. We're doing our third part of our study in the book of Esther tonight, and I invite you to go in your Bibles to Esther chapters 5 and 6, where I've entitled our lesson for this evening, Many Surprises, because a lot is going to be happening tonight in the story. This, I mentioned earlier, is probably the most comical, if I can put it that way, in some ways, of the lessons on Esther, because it's just special, all right? And I'll kind of leave it at that point just to kind of describe Esther chapters 5 and 6 in general. Let me go ahead and share with you just a quick story before we get right into the scriptures. Some of us, I'm sure, are familiar with Corrie ten Boom. She wrote a number of books, the most famous of which was The Hiding Place. Basically the story of her and her family and how they used to hide Jews from the Nazis in the Netherlands during World War II. And eventually Corrie and her family got caught. And Corrie was the only one out of her immediate family that survived out of the concentration camp. But the story is that Corrie was suddenly released from Ravensbrück, the camp where she had been sent in Germany and where her sister Betsy had died. She suddenly was released in January 1945 and went home. Well, she found out months and months later that it was a clerical error. What was supposed to happen was that Corrie, along with all the other women of her particular age bracket, were scheduled to be executed. Corrie was the only one that was released. Kind of one of those coincidences that's not really a coincidence. It's basically, again, the Lord working out a situation, because Corrie ten Boom went on to have a very extensive ministry lasting for well over 30 years, traveling all over the world, preaching the gospel. So the Lord, I'm just sharing that to point this out. The Lord often is at work behind many surprises, like what happened to Corrie ten Boom, and like what will be seen in the book of Esther today. Now, these two chapters are a reminder, first of all, the Lord is really the one who determines the course of events. A lot of times we think we're in charge of the future, but we're not. As James tells us in James chapter 4, verses 13 to 16, James wrote this, beginning at verse 13, chapter 4. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, engage in business, and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. For you are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. In other words, God's in charge of the future. We're not. All right? Second thing, before we get into Esther chapters 5 and 6, is this. Behind the various surprises that are sprung upon King Ahasuerus and Haman, remember he's the bad guy, in these chapters is again the sovereign, invisible hand of God, working through coincidences and the actions of people like Esther and Mordecai. And I love what the writer Frederick Buechner wrote, a coincidence is just God's way of remaining anonymous. All right? So let's take a look. If you remember from last week, Mordecai had pleaded with his ward Esther to go to the king and to talk to the king to stop Haman's evil decree, which Haman is intent upon killing all of the Jews throughout the entire Persian Empire. And Esther was at first hesitant to do this because she had not been summoned and had not seen the king for over 30 days. Eventually, she was persuaded that indeed she had probably come to her position for, as Mordecai put it, for such a time as this, and she asked Mordecai to get the Jews of Susa to do a severe fast of 3 days, no food, no water, she and her maidens would do the same, and then she would go to the king, and as she put it, if I die, I die, but I'm going to go. All right? So at the beginning of chapter 5, Esther is coming before the king, okay? So let's just kind of read through verses 1 to 8, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about some of the things we see here. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of the king's room. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Now, archaeologists have not uncovered this throne room, but they have uncovered the throne room in another Persian capital, Persepolis. This room was some 65 feet high and several hundred feet across, with these pillars throughout the entire room supporting this massive structure. So it was ginormous. And Esther appears at this one side, and she stands and she waits to see what the king will do. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the courtyard, she obtained his favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. Remember, if he doesn't do that, she dies. But he did it. She has favor with him. Again, God works upon the heart of a king and guides it like he guides everyone else, according to Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. So Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you." By the way, that's an exaggeration. He doesn't really intend to give her half the kingdom, but it kind of fits along with Ahasuerus' character. Okay? Esther said, "If it please the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for them." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your request? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your wish? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." So Esther replied, "My request and my wish is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I wish, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." All right. Did you notice she is called Queen Esther? Now, this title has been used for her when she was first brought to this position 5 years earlier. But it's one thing to have the title. It's another thing to actually act with courage and bravery like a true queen, and that's what Esther is doing. Now, granted, she's been fasting. Undoubtedly, she's been praying, so now she has the inner spiritual strength and reserves that only God can provide her to do what she's doing. And again, notice the fact that she has favor with the king, which obviously had to be what the king involved the Lord working upon the king, because the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Now, if you never read Esther before, you probably would have been like me when I read it first. And I would think, with given the situation involving Esther's people, immediately when the king says, "What's troubling you? What's the matter? Why are you here?" I would have blurted out, "This is what's going on. My people are going to be exterminated unless you do something." But Esther's a whole lot smarter than I am. She takes a step back. She asks for the king and Haman to come to a private banquet. And it's not just one banquet. She asks for them to come to a second banquet afterwards. By the way, in this little book of Esther, there's some 20 banquets that happen all together. Feasting, banqueting is kind of a big theme in the book. Why doesn't Esther immediately follow what her guardian Mordecai wants her to do and tell the king what the problem is? Well, we don't know. So let's take some guesses as to why she's delaying a bit. First of all, location. In a throne room, lots of attendants, maybe even Haman himself is standing there. Chances are this is probably not the best setting to confront the king with a big problem that basically he has helped to create by handing over his authority to Haman. The king may become deeply humiliated, embarrassed, may become angry, because basically Ahasuerus is kind of like a loaded cannon that can go off at any time. All right? Also, remember, if she sets up the situation to where it's just her, the king, and Haman, and then presents the problem, chances are Haman's not going to have a whole lot of wiggle room to try to kind of dodge, to try to kind of come up with an excuse. Basically, it's going to trap him, all right? Where it's just going to be the three of them. And finally, remember, Esther is not relying on her own insight, all right? She is undoubtedly trusting the Lord. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 kind of come to mind. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will guide and direct your steps. All right. So she invites them to this banquet. Why does Esther seem to be dawdling? Notice her careful answer that she gives to the king at the end of the first banquet. Let's take a look at it one more time. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I wish, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I have prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. The idea is the king is already like 90% there to give her whatever she is asking, because she has carefully set up the situation before she even tells the king exactly what she wants. Esther is a great example of someone who lives by godly wisdom, especially in a treacherous environment, which is where she is. Proverbs 14:15, great verse for this. The simple believe anything, but the prudent, that's Esther, give thought to their steps. All right? So, she's told the king, I'm going to tell you at the second banquet. So the king returns to whatever the king does. Haman leaves the palace, and Haman is in a very good mood. All right? So let's pick it up at verse 9. Then Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and he did not stand up or tremble before him. Now remember, earlier, Mordecai refused to bow down. Now Mordecai is just sitting there. He's just ignoring Haman, like Haman doesn't exist. Even more, it irritates Haman. Haman was filled with rage against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house. But he sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them all the glory of his riches and his many sons, and every occasion on which the king had honored him, and how he had promoted him above the officials and servants of the king. Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one except me come with the king to the banquet which she prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a wooden, now I'm reading from the New American Standard. In italics, they insert the word gallows. Actually, what the text says is simply wooden something. It could be a gallows, like, a hangman gallows, like what we're used to. It could also be a sharp wooden stake. It can be either. Have a wooden gallows 50 cubits high, 75 feet high, in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the wooden gallows made. Now, how high do you have to put someone on a gallows to hang him? I'd say about a foot above the ground, wouldn't you? So what's the big deal about 75 feet in the air? Now remember, ancient cities are not exactly tall. They're more spread out. Probably the tallest building in Susa, which undoubtedly would have been the king's palace, was probably about 50 or 60 feet high. So something that high is going to tower over the city, so everybody's going to see it. The point of the gallows is Haman's pride. That's why he wants to put Mordecai up so high, basically to show this is what happens to anybody who defies me and does what Mordecai does, which is simply, I'm going to ignore you. Haman's pathetic medicine to his bruised, swollen ego is to boast. He boasts before his wife, he boasts before his friends and his advisors. Basically, everything he's telling them is stuff that they already know, okay? Yet, he says, this means nothing to me as long as Mordecai the Jew is alive. Now, Haman's problem is his pride. And we're told that there are actually seven things that God absolutely hates, according to Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 to 19. And the very first of those is someone with a prideful look, haughty eyes. And that is Haman's number one character fault is his pride. It's his ego. So anyway, he puts this up, and he's happy, and sometime that evening, after he spent the rest of the day getting this gallows set up, or this pole set up, he returns to the palace. All right? By this time it's evening, and the beginning of chapter 6 is the hinge upon which the entire story turns. And all it involves is the king has a sleepless night. Okay? Chapter 6, verse 1. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. Think of it like a dictionary. Just read me something and put me to sleep. By the way, Ecclesiastes 5:12, it says there, sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. Someone else will not let him sleep, and that's the Lord. Because according to the Greek Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, it translates this part of the story, the Lord removed sleep from the king that night. Let's keep going. And it was found written what Mordecai had reported about Bigthana and Teresh. Remember we read this story back in chapter 2? Two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to attack King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing's been done for him." Guys, this happened 5 years ago, that Mordecai had saved the king's life. So suddenly, Ahasuerus is now wide awake. He realizes this is a huge issue. He's got to do something to make up for this, because literally, Mordecai saved his life. So the king said, "Who's in the courtyard?" Now Haman had just entered the outer courtyard of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the wooden gallows which he had prepared for him. So the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard." And the king said, "Have him come in." Now, I don't know if some of you have ever seen the comedy team Abbott and Costello do something called Who's on First, What's on Second. all right? If you have, this is something like that, all right? Because Haman is coming in with his agenda. I want to kill Mordecai. I need the king's okay. I already built the gallows, okay? The king is thinking, I got to do something to honor Mordecai. So the king's got his agenda, Haman's got his agenda, and it just happens to be the king speaks first. Haman then came, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? Who does the king mean? Mordecai. And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? I love what Adele Berlin, a Jewish scholar, wrote. She said, the most outstanding characteristic of Haman is that he is a glutton for honor. And Karen Jobes, a Christian scholar, she wrote, Haman magnificently trips over his own pride. Now, look what he says. The only way Haman could come up with this is this had to be kind of a fond desire or daydream of his, because he's got a ready answer. What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? By the way, the Hebrew word kavod that's normally translated honor can also be translated glory. Think of that as well, okay? But let's read it. Verse 7. Therefore Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, have them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal turban has been placed. Evidently, they did a little doodad with the horse's hair to kind of fix it up, to make it poofy, okay? Then order them to hand the robe and the horse over to one of the king's noble officials, and have them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square. So all throughout the city square of Susa. Proclaim before him, so shall it be done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Now, Haman thinks he's describing what's going to happen to him as he's going through this. Now, you got to picture this. He wants to wear the king's robes. He wants to ride on the king's horse. He wants to be paraded, basically, to receive honor throughout the entire city. You get kind of the idea of what Haman is up to? He wants to play king. And by the way, if he gets all of this, the only thing that he still does not have is the queen. And that's going to come up in the very next chapter. Just how far, especially when Ahasuerus starts to think this through, just how far does this guy want to go? Okay? Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, quickly, take the robe and the horse you have just said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fail to do anything of all that you have said. Calamity of calamities, horror of horrors. That, guys, is called a reversal. Okay? Everything that Haman hoped for, he now has to do for his bitter enemy. Now, remember, Haman's issue is his pride. No one is better at humbling a proud, godless person than the Lord. And I don't have time to take you there, but sometime read 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verses 13 to 15, and then verses 20 to 22. 2 Chronicles 32. There you'll read about an Assyrian king named Sennacherib, who brought his army down and besieged the little kingdom of Judah. And Sennacherib also had a pride problem. Long story short, the bulk of his army was destroyed one night by an angel of the Lord. Sennacherib had to quickly retreat. Some 20 years later, he was killed by two of his own sons within the temple of his God. A proud man quickly brought low, just like Haman. So Haman took the robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "So shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." It had to be like gravel in Haman's mouth as he said this over and over again. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Now, that's easy to miss. Mordecai, okay, all right, you want to put me on the king's horse and lead me around, and yeah, I know you absolutely hate me because you got to do what the king says, ha, ha, ha. But it's like, Mordecai, it's no big deal. It doesn't turn his head, all right? And that's easy to overlook. Haman is now the one dishonored and disgraced in the public square, but as for Mordecai, after his reward, and it was pretty spectacular, after his reward is completed, he just goes back to work. He works at the city gate. He goes back to the city gate. Praise and honor will not change someone of solid character. All right? The crucible is for silver, the furnace is for gold, and a man is tested by his praise. But what about Haman? Verse 13. And Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered, symbol of mourning. And Haman informed Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends of everything that had happened to him. Now notice they're singing a different tune now. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not prevail over him." Oh, thank you for telling me that now. "But will certainly fall before him." While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. This, by the way, first of all, they tell him this time, oh, you're not going to be able to resist this person because they happen to be Jewish. That's basically going clear back to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, where Abraham was told, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. All right? That's tapping into basically the promise of the Abrahamic covenant. But this is also, guys, what's sometimes called in Scripture the foreigner's confession. And it's not the isolated instance of it. For example, Rahab. When Rahab decides to defend, or not defend, but to hide the Israelite spies from the authorities in Jericho, she then comes and tells the spies, basically, we're all terrified of you. All right, we're terrified of the Lord because we heard the Lord is sending the nation of Israel to come and to destroy this land. That's another example of the foreigner's confession. All right, unwittingly, Zeresh and Haman's friends are acknowledging that there's something very special about the Jews, and that something that's very special is someone, the Lord Yahweh, who's looking out for them. The final scene in chapter 6. An unprepared, flustered, demoralized Haman is rushed off to Esther's second banquet and his execution, which happens right away. But we're going to have to save that for our final lesson on the book of Esther, okay? Let's go ahead and talk briefly about some final thoughts we can draw from tonight's lesson. First of all, number one, we need to be prepared for whatever challenges the Lord may bring our way. Trying to play catch up when in a crisis is never good. And a verse from Job chapter 5, verse 7, man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. I want you to remember, Esther, before she set foot in that throne room, had done what she could, also depending upon her community, to prepare her through her fasting and undoubtedly through her praying, although we're not told that, but she probably undoubtedly did that. She did what she could to be prepared before she went before the king. Number two, we need to avoid getting hung up about the issue of honor and recognition. That was Haman's huge character flaw, among other things. But this guy could never get enough honor, never get enough recognition. Mordecai, I'm sure Mordecai was deeply disappointed that he had been overlooked for 5 years and receiving honor and recognition for saving the life of the king. But when it came finally, and it came in a spectacular way, it didn't turn his head. So Paul writes in Romans 12:3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." It's so easy for us to have too high of an opinion of ourselves or too low an opinion of ourselves. And really, the only way to get an accurate opinion of ourselves is based upon our walk with the Lord and upon His Word. We can't judge that. We need basically the Lord to help us. And then finally, number 3, again a reminder, are you watching for God's unseen hand that surprises how He works in our lives to make us better disciples for Jesus? Guys, a lot of times it's so subtle we don't pick up on it. But God is constantly remolding and remaking us to be better servants for Him. He was doing that in Esther's time, and He's doing the same thing in our time. Please join us for our final study in Esther, which we'll be doing that the following week. Bye for now.